Welcome to the Endpoints podcast, presented by the ALS Therapy Development Institute. I'm Jonathan Gang. Nobody knows ALS better than people living with the disease. Therefore, it's crucial for scientists to utilize the perspectives of people with lived experience in their research. Earlier this year, ALS TDI joined forces with Her ALS Story, a group of women diagnosed with ALS before the age of 35, to put on a series of town hall webinars that highlighted the importance of this connection. The three-part series featured discussions about ALS risk factors, lesser-known symptoms, and stories of diagnosis. Each time, researchers from ALS TDI's ALS Research Collaborative, or ARC study, presented information about our current scientific understanding of each topic, while Her ALS Story members shared their own personal experiences. Today, on Endpoints, we'll hear some highlights from each episode of the series. We'll also be joined by Dr. Danielle Boyce, ALS TDI's Principal Investigator, Real-World Evidence, and Alan Premasiri, our Director of Clinical Operations, to discuss what they learned from the discussions and how conversations like these can help shape the way they approach their research.
Yeah, so we were very fortunate to have this webinar town hall program with Her ALS Story, which is a group that I've had the good fortune of collaborating with and getting to know for years. Really an incredible community of younger women with ALS. And the idea was that we wanted to do some kind of town hall series with them, and we worked collaboratively with them to identify some topics that were really important to them. And so the format was, what we decided on was Alan would cover what it is that the ARC study currently captures and how, and what maybe the history of how different data elements were determined and what he might like to do in the future. And I would take a piece of our current ARC data and analyze it and present it, and what we know about whatever's relevant to that topic, and then some other information. So for example, with the risk factor, I got into kind of detail about Dr. Al-Shalabi's that 6 risk factors that lead to ALS, and the blog that we did about that. And we talked a little bit about that and some of the concepts, but also we looked at some of the risk factors that we analyzed from our own data. And then for the diagnostic, and then that was my bit. And then the next part was the actual people with lived experience would tell us from their perspective something about that topic. And so we would always have 2 or 3 people on the panel who would contribute their really valuable lived experience. And we also, for each of these, our wonderful marketing team, Megan, would put out a survey and ask individuals, just kind of like a casual fact-finding kind of brainstorming survey among their community about this topic. So I would have some data about the topic that was kind of fresh that would help to contribute to discussion. So I would analyze that, and some of them I did qualitative and analytics, and others I just kind of summarized the themes, and then after they would speak, then we would have a discussion, a Q&A, and there would be a lot of information put in the chat as well. And so what we came away with was really a treasure trove of rich information, questions that they would like to see answered, and one, firsthand experience about these different topics that have really helped us to refine our research questions.
Premasiri says that Her ALS Story was an ideal group to work with for a series like this.
Her ALS Story is, they are not only experts in their ALS, but they're experts in talking to each other and supporting each other about these peculiar situations that they end up in, or the lesser known symptoms, or the long diagnostic processes. And they all learn from the experience of talking to each other. And it's one thing to have these experiences. When it comes to improving the field research capabilities, it's another to be able to talk about it in a way that it can be put to action. So I think Her ALS Story has done a very good job of educating all their members, of supporting all their members, so that they can all go out. We had different people on each call. It wasn't the same 2 people on each call. So they're all comfortable sharing their information in these sort of scenarios that makes it easier for us to digest that information.
Dr. Boyce says that, in addition to their skill in sharing their stories, the women of Her ALS Story also represent a population that is underrepresented in ALS research.
For me, we don't hear a lot about women with ALS, period, let alone younger women. And we don't hear a lot about younger people with ALS. And so they might have a different set of risk factors or diagnostic challenges. You know, a lot of times you'll hear, oh, ALS is for something that people who are older get, because it is age related, but there might be a different set of circumstances that might give rise to a young woman or a young person having ALS, and it might present differently. And so in most of our studies, all of, not just our ARC study, but all studies will show an older demographic. And often male, often skews male. We have these pockets and subsets of this already poorly understood disease that might give us clues and hints as to how it is developed, not just in young women, but across all women. So from a scientific standpoint, that's really valuable. From just an advocacy standpoint, it's really important that we connect with experts who talk to other experts. And experts, I mean people with ALS. You know, it's really important that we talk to people with ALS who are experts in their own disease and can talk to one another and can bring us this information and help to make sure that we are looking in the right places and we're collecting the right information.
The first town hall covered ALS risk factors, something that scientists know little about, although research is ongoing. At the event, Jamie Pellegrin from Her ALS Story offered her perspective on what she believed might have contributed to her disease onset.
I know several of the other members in our group, coincidentally enough, if you will, or, look further into it, are nurses or in the healthcare profession under high stress level positions. We all work in different areas, so not just med-surg ICU, but just high stress with nursing. I'm also a type 1 diabetic, so autoimmune definitely checked that box for me as well. Like I said, I was pregnant with my son when my symptoms really came to light. And one of my genes in my genetic workup was unspecified, but after speaking to my neurologist now, she believes it's juvenile ALS that I have, ALS subgroup 5 or something like that. So like Danielle, doctor had said, I'm like the perfect storm of all the hits. I can identify them. So I definitely do agree with that. And after speaking to so many of the other women in our group, I truly do believe that we all have several things that have occurred, not just one medicine, one thing. It's multiple things that came up. So definitely a mixture of sorts. I am from Southern Louisiana and in a smaller town, in about a 20-mile radius. I have 5 women that I know of, all 55 and younger, that have ALS. 4 of us are in the healthcare profession, 3 of which are nurses. So several of my things, being a nurse, keeps popping up very high in the numbers. So I find it very hard to believe it's strictly coincidental with it all.
Kelly McGinn, who also presented at the event, shared a different perspective. Unlike Jamie, she doesn't have any specific circumstances she suspects might have contributed to her disease.
And I'm kind of don't really know what caused my ALS. I'm kind of on that side of the spectrum where I was a smoker, but I didn't really. I wish I knew that instead of just about cancer that they warned, but I was a smoker. I had a couple of concussions like 20 years ago. I had a pinched nerve or something in my left shoulder at one point, but again, 17 years ago. So I don't really have one thing that I can pinpoint mine to, but a lot of other people can. And so it's just kind of shows that full spectrum.
Premasiri says these differing perspectives highlight a challenge in risk factor research and are important to consider when gathering data.
There was one person who was pretty sure or felt strongly about the series of events that led up to their symptom onset and their diagnosis. And then the other person who pretty much in one sentence swiftly was like, no idea. And opening these discussions allows us to find, even not knowing is fine. It doesn't mean there wasn't a cause. And we have to acknowledge that that doesn't mean that. And it's not on the participant or the patient to know,
Right.
to know or not know, right? Like we will look at the ones who did, and we can work off of that. And then it just means, all right, so how do we evaluate? How do we start thinking about, for the people who aren't sure? That is information. Not having information is information, because they did still do it. It doesn't mean they didn't do anything with their lives up to that point. They did. They just don't have any strong, considerations or links. And so as researchers, how do we probe further? How do we capture information in a way that can maybe lead us to figuring out maybe something that was part of their triggers, or not, or maybe it's just too many little things, or it was something so far gone that nobody would have ever connected the dots, or maybe there was just there's a biological component that we just can't see, and so that does still get us. It still gets the motor running on that. It's not just about knowing the exact paper trail to get to the diagnosis.
The next town hall covered lesser-known ALS symptoms. Stephanie Cantos of Her ALS Story shared some of the symptoms that she found most confusing in the early days of her disease.
It wasn't too long, I think, after I was diagnosed, I started noticing I was having trouble opening my eyelids, right when I would blink. So I'd kind of blink, and then eyelids, it was like they just kind of got stuck there. And that is actually very frustrating. I would also say so when I yawn, and this is something I noticed before I was diagnosed, when I yawn, like my shoulders will kind of shake. I do feel like I yawn, I'm gonna say quite a bit. I'm trying to think. You know what else? Oh gosh, I experienced the retropulsion, which is, I'd say, a little concerning, and also kind of scary, because honestly the only way I can stop is either I'm gonna hit something or someone has to grab me. And yeah, I have the dry scalp. Right, my eyes definitely, I feel like, water more than they did. Yeah, and honestly, I feel like I wish that people would honestly take, I feel like some of those early symptoms, I feel like a little bit more seriously. I remember I went into a neurologist who treats my migraines, and I told him, I was like, I was having this really weird cramping, like my back or like my stomach when I cough or when I sneeze. And he was like, well, we can run some blood work. He's like, you can see if you're dehydrated. He's like, honestly, he said, my hands, like, they can cramp. He's like, if I've been working in the yard for a while. I was like, I feel like this is just a smidge different.
Ashley Rivera had similar experiences of feeling like some of her early symptoms were dismissed on the way toward diagnosis.
So my first symptoms were my right hand cramping, along with a left foot drop. And if I could toot my own horn, I took very good care of my shoes. So when I noticed them becoming scuffed at the bottom, I said, "Oh, we have to go to the doctor." I know that's a little vain, but I knew something was not right. And I knew I wasn't dehydrated because as an athlete, I knew how to replenish my electrolytes. But along with my ALS sisters on the call, I am forever itchy now. I don't have a non-itch day. And with that comes along the acid tears, the cold hands, the cold feet. But one thing that I really noticed early on were much painful periods and menstrual cycles. And one thing I'm really pushing for at clinic is a gynecologist to pay attention to women's health, because the uterus is a very powerful muscle. And for a woman who pays very good attention to that part of her body, it wasn't normal. They put me on birth control, wasn't normal after that. It actually got worse. And it took a long time to be taken serious. So not only as a woman, but as a Puerto Rican woman who grew up in the South Bronx, were seen as strong individuals. And don't get me wrong, we are as women, but we should be taken seriously.
Caitlin Swanson discussed her own perplexing symptoms and how, at one point after diagnosis, she experienced a different kind of dismissal when symptoms of another condition were blamed on her ALS.
ALS is a confusing disease because the rapid progression results in continual changes in functionality. So sometimes it's difficult to differentiate between the combination of symptoms and anything else. Like, I struggled with gallbladder leakage and stones for months, but my doctors all just assumed the excruciating, debilitating spasms were the natural progression of ALS. It wasn't until my sister forced me to go to the emergency room, which I strenuously argued against since I'd been told by multiple specialists that it was just typical ALS, that fortunately revealed I needed to have my gallbladder removed immediately. That experience really reinforces the benefits of being involved in the amazingly supportive ALS community. Because in our chat, we've discussed everything from our increased earwax, possibly due to inflammation, to the shocking acid tears, maybe due to increased CO2 levels, to the comorbidity of other autoimmune disorders that so many of us have.
Dr. Boyce says that learning more about these lesser-known symptoms is crucial for improving the ALS diagnosis process.
For me, I think just the part about just having so many symptoms, like so many ophthalmological symptoms that so many people mention. Now, granted, it's anecdotal and it's a fairly small sample, but I'm also hearing that they're hearing this, like part of this was they were representing their community, and that they're hearing some of these things from a lot of people. And the other piece of that is the feeling dismissed. So how, responsible are we, as scientists to document and share these lesser known symptoms that people who have ALS feel very strongly are different and, have been different since their other symptom onset that are well known, right? And they believe are part of the package strongly. And so what kind of responsibility do we have as scientists to document that? Because it contributes to that diagnostic delay, which in ALS is everything. Because if you're delayed in your diagnosis, you might not get into a clinical trial. So just getting the word out and documenting, again, like documenting and publishing on these things and what we learned, I think is just going to be so important It's already hard to get diagnosed when you have typical symptoms of ALS.
For Premasiri, the conversation underlined the challenge of gathering data about a disease with so many diverse symptoms.
For me, it sort of builds off of Danielle's point, and the other of Danielle's points that is important here is how do we get clinicians on a national level to acknowledge certain symptoms, and that's through research and publication, right? Otherwise, one-off clinicians will maybe acquiesce to certain people's symptoms, but of course others will have completely different experiences where nobody's listening to them because it's not in the research and so on. So when one of the Her ALS Story members commented on being itchy, particularly itchy, in my mind, I'm trying to think, okay, how do we capture more symptoms in the ARC study? Like how do we design the survey to be able to capture these extra symptoms? And right now we do a lot of like check boxes or drop downs, things that are set in stone. But in particular, in that discussion, she had specifically said forever itchy, which is an element of time that we wouldn't capture. It's not just a list of symptoms, it's how often those symptoms are.
Yeah.
And then it gets me thinking, what's the magnitude of the symptom?
Yeah.
Like how intense are the symptoms, right? And then there's a delicate balance because you want to be able to capture as much of that information as you can, but you don't want to overwhelm the participant with writing paragraphs about their condition, right? And on top of all the other things they have to do in the study. So it really gets me thinking of like, okay, what's the most efficient way? How do we get a lot of information that isn't an open-ended interview, essentially, that's like a 90-minute interview that you might see in another study, but not limit ourselves to having to predetermine a list of items that they have to select from. And part of that is going to be me and Danielle will think about these things and try to do our best to come up with an answer. But part of that is going to be going back to the patient community and being like, okay, you're doing these tasks already, but you're feeling like you're not saying everything, or you're not being able to get across everything that was part of your journey. So what do you think about this type of survey that can capture that information? Is it too much burden? Is it enough? And so those sort of logistics are what I was thinking about when people were going off listing their symptoms.
Yeah.
It was like, okay, how do we actually do that? And how do we make it in a way so that everybody will do that? Because of course, the other thing is that Her ALS Story members are very good at talking about this stuff and they do it all the time. But as we said, there are people in the chat who never talk about this, right? And it doesn't occur to them to talk about it either when they're participating in a study. And so we have to sort of, in some cases, spark that sort of line of thinking. And it's not just as simple as list all your symptoms. Go. Right. So that is where my gears were going during that town hall.
The final event in the series featured stories about ALS diagnosis, a long, difficult process that can be even more challenging for people not thought of as the typical population for the disease. At the town hall, Atiliana Gibson shared her story of being diagnosed while she was pregnant with her daughter.
I was newly pregnant with my daughter, and I kept experiencing falls and like a tingling down the back of my left leg. And my OBGYN was first thinking maybe it's sciatica due to the positioning of my daughter. But then the falls started to happen, and they were growing increasingly more as my pregnancy progressed. So she sent me to have a MRI, I want to test, and everything came back normal. And my falls, the tingling in my leg just wouldn't go away. So they then switched me from a regular OB to a high risk pregnancy team. And Then I went and had blood work done, another set of MRIs, CAT scans, and there was another test they did, but I can't remember what it was. And after the last test that the high risk pregnancy doctors sent me to see a neurologist who did another set of MRIs, CAT scans, blood work, and everything kept coming back normal. So she was like, I want to do one more test to see what is going on so that we can figure this out. So my testing started in like the end of November, beginning of December of 2022. And then in April of 2023, I had a EMG done because they couldn't figure out any other tests to do. So we did the EMG on like a Friday afternoon, and I could tell that something was wrong by the facial expressions of the neurologist that was doing the EMG. And he just basically told me, this is a conversation that you and your neurologist needed to have. So I went crazy with Google over that weekend, and the Google searches were coming up for MND, and I didn't understand what that meant at the time. And the following week, I went back in to see my now neurologist, and they explained to me that what was wrong was that I had ALS. And I got the diagnosis April 26th, and I was 7.5 months pregnant with my daughter at the time.
Gwen Peterson followed, describing her own long journey to a diagnosis and the incorrect diagnoses she received along the way.
So it took me 18 long months to receive my diagnosis. I felt we were on a previous slide, we were talking about sort of other reasons for delays, and mine was a misdiagnosis of anxiety, which is, you know, a real epidemic in healthcare wide, the anxiety misdiagnosis. And along the way, I saw several doctors, well, I went straight to my primary care doctor when I was similar to Tiliana, having balance issues, gait issues, repeated falls. So like most of us do, I went to my primary doctor. She was the one who said, you know, I think you have too much going on. It's anxiety. Again, the falls continued. So I saw a series of doctors after that. It really wasn't until I established care at a university level hospital, where there was a specialty ALS center, a multidisciplinary clinic, and that's where I started really getting answers. And as you know, most of us don't go to a MDC, and a lot of our MDCs are in major cities, and most of us live outside of major cities. So it's just one more reason why the diagnosis takes so long.
Dr. Boyce says that the conversations from this series have already inspired her to dig into ARC data and think of ways that we could learn more about the issues raised in the Her ALS Story presentations.
After that town hall about the diagnoses, which was our last one, the Diagnostic Odyssey, I was so grateful and energized. It really got my creative energy going. And I spent the following 4 days straight, all through the weekend, looking again at our electronic health records data. And I created a template for a narrative for each person, all all the people we have EHR data on, where I went back all the way to the beginning of anything that we knew. And in one person, for one type of record, I had 11,000 plus pages for him alone. And I went through all the way through and I wrote their narrative as if they were telling me their story, like on the town hall. As if I could explain their history. Looks like he went into the doctor in 2011. He had lab work here. This seems a little high. Then he had this happen, and then that happened. I went all the way through. Then he went to the doctor complaining of this issue, happened to be on his right hand, then this issue with his finger, now this with his shoulder. And look at this, and can we explain it? And I went all the way through and told their story as if he was in front of me, with the backup data to show for it in spreadsheet format. But this hybrid approach, that to me, like, was what really that town hall series did for me. Was to energize me at the importance of finding this stuff, but in a way that's both biologically plausible, but also that does justice to the people who are sharing the data. If we're going to collect all of this data, then we really need to tell those timelines and those stories. Can we tell this story? And so what we're inspired to do now is potentially follow up and talk to some of these folks who we have the EHR data on. And I've made these narratives. Did I get it right? Did I get this right? Because there's something about a narrative. I work in both qualitative and quantitative data, but there's something about, and I know this as a mom who is a child with rare disease, and I'm in these social media groups where we're all telling our stories. We phenotype that way, kind of informally phenotype each other that way. And that's what we need in ALS, is to tell our stories and understand these stories and then have the data to back it up. So I'm basically working in reverse, taking the data and then pushing it out into a narrative and then seeing if it rings true with the person who shared the data with me. So that was really a breakthrough for me that came as a result of this town hall. How can we tell those stories better? Using the data that we have. And it's not just in a spreadsheet somewhere, but it's a person who had this happen to them. And can we feel that along with them and have that inspire better research?
Following these conversations, Premasiri says the next step will be to look at how the ARC study could collect better data to reflect the issues raised by the women of Her ALS Story.
Next steps for me are actually mapping out let's ask this specific question about symptoms, or we'll ask it in this way with this branching, and we'll store it in these tables like this, and we'll use multiple tables that we can join with some sort of unique identifier or whatever, so that it's easy to call that data later. And then how do we join that data with all the rest of the data so that it's easy to compare, these symptoms or whatever to accelerometer data or biological data, right? And the longer you spend on that, the shorter it'll take to eventually analyze that data, I think, as opposed to if you just kind of just throw it together and you just come up with some open-ended survey and then you realize, okay, we have to mine the data, we have to clean the data, and then we have to join the data. And that all can take many weeks. So the more planning I can do in advance based off of the framework of what I heard from the town hall, the better it'll serve me in the long run when it comes to analyzing the data.
Leah Stavenhagen, founder and president of Her ALS Story, similarly said that conversations like these are essential to bridging the gap between lived experience and research. She wrote in a statement, quote, "From conversations about the causes of ALS to lesser-known symptoms to ways to improve the diagnosis process, this town hall series covered a range of topics that are often top of mind for people living with ALS. It is invaluable to hear the perspectives of researchers and patients together. ALS continues to largely be an enigma for us. It is through collaboration between the various stakeholders that we can begin to chip away at the complexities of this disease." Her ALS Story was thrilled to partner with ALS TDI on this webinar series for exactly this reason. Together, we can help bridge the gap between science and lived experience, so we look forward to continuing to collaborate on additional initiatives. End quote. To learn more about Her ALS Story and their mission to provide community support and advocacy for young women with ALS, visit heralsstory.org. The ARC study is the longest-running natural history study in ALS. It is available to anyone living with ALS or asymptomatic carriers of ALS-related genetic mutations anywhere in the world. All participation is fully remote and can be completed from home. All that's required is an internet connection. If you're interested in contributing to ALS research, visit als.net/ARC. Thanks for listening.